I have the good fortune today to be talking with a fellow who shares shares a last name with a lot of Mowgli icons over the years, and he himself is a bit of an icon. I've been looking forward to talking with you, Scott Gibbs,
Me
about
too, Wayne, very much. I appreciate your persistence in getting a hold of me. I can be hard to pin down at times.
yeah. Well, all right. So lead us through how it was that Scott Gibbs came to Maui.
Well, we'll start with the name. That was a big part of it. My family was involved with the camp very early on. My name is Scott Alcott Gibbs. My middle name, I'm actually named after Alcott Farrer Elwell.
Wow.
When mom and dad were out of the service, my dad, he grew up in Hebron, the town up at the head of the lake. And that was the first place I ever lived, was in Colonel Elwell's house. I don't remember it, but my dad had a lot of stories about it. And so in his honor, they named me Scott Alcott Gibbs. For years and years and years, I never knew why my folks chose my first name with one T. And I was in my 50s. I asked my mom, so why one T? And she said, because your middle name has two T's. That was it. Nothing more exotic than that. In the place where I've worked recently, I work with a lot of young urban kids there, and there was another Scott with two T's, so I was Scott with one T. Later, I became one T, and so that became a nickname. So that when I told him that was my rap name, which great hilarity ensued. Middle-aged, ancient white guy with a rap name. So that's the story.
Huh.
And
And your dad was Carter Gibbs.
my father was Carter Gibbs. He was a tripmaster, and he grew up in Hebron. He was kind of the icon in Hebron. If you go to the little town square there, I will say that town square has not changed since the 50s. It looks exactly the same. The buildings are painted the same colors. It's like a time capsule. And that's why I haven't really contacted much in Mowgli. Uh, I've been back in New Hampshire for over 30 years, but that was always kind of it was a very precious time to me. And I kind of left it in a time capsule. In a sense, it was kind of the end of my boyhood. Well, end of that part of my boyhood. The boyhood still continues, but my dad was, he was, and Colonel Elwell, I mentioned this to you. There's up by Sculptured Rocks. If you go to Sculptured Rocks, there's a dirt road up behind there, which is where the Carter Gibbs Trail took off. And he grew up. My grandfather, George Gibbs, was actually the caretaker at the camp. And Myron Braley, who you mentioned, I think he ran the wood shop, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he was kind of the maintenance guy.
Yeah, well, my grandfather was too. My grandfather had passed by the time I think he
Yeah, I
had.
never knew your grandfather.
Yeah, and at one point, and my grandmother actually worked in the laundry there. But my grandfather had this old Dodge stake bed truck, and he would take campers. He took us to Ackerman's Field a few years before I was at camp. He took kids all the way to Katahdin in the back of a open rickety old Dodge truck. I mean,
No
and
kidding. Huh.
yeah, and he was a subsistence farmer. I actually helped him when I was a kid, milk cows, and we actually slopped the hogs, the whole 9 yards. But my father grew up in the woods, and they named the Carter Gibbs Trail after him. And Colonel Elwell went to USGS, and they asked him very seriously if he was dead or famous. And Colonel Elwell deadpan said, "Oh, he's very famous." And in Hebron he was. There's a plaque there on the town square. It's on a rock of men who had served in World War II era. My uncle Ivan also was at camp. I don't believe he was a
Right.
tripmaster, but he was there as well. So as we talked about, he gave the gun show up at my grandmother's farm.
Yeah.
So and they were able to procure a scholarship for me to go to camp. That's how I went. So my dad started out, grew up in the woods, and he hunted, and he grew up during the Depression. So, and the camp was, a big a big part of my family life growing up. The legends. I mean, just talking with you on the phone the other day kind of sparked a lot of those. That my dad was quite a raconteur, and he would tell the same stories over and over. First, you oh, not again. But by the end of the story, he'd have you involved. He was a great storyteller.
Yeah.
At one point, there was a rifle in the library. I believe it was the Gibbs rifle. That was named after
Right.
my grandfather. They had, you had, I forget, it was for whatever the honors were in rifle, where you got your name on a silver or a gold brass plaque on the stock. That may have been retired since, but and say one of the first things I did when I came back from Colorado well, I was actually living in Utah at that point. Came back here was to take my grandmother to crew day, uh, and she, my uncle Ever the Outlaw was he wore a red bandana to camp, and my father was Blue Crew, and my father never rode on a losing crew, and neither did I. I never made it to racing crew, but still to this day, I think it's my favorite sport. As a team sport, very in character with Mowgli. I can
Yeah.
remember as a little boy in the summers they had it's still there. It was a cabin that was it wasn't really a cabin. It was on a little peninsula, an island called Lone Wolf Island, and I believe they had the counselors meetings there, and we stayed there a couple times in the summer. But any rate, say my grandmother was at she was in the laundry that was down in the basement there, or used to be, and you would put your clothes in a laundry bag and bring them to them once a week. When I was a kid, I didn't like wool because it was scratchy, and as you know, the uniforms are wool. So she pawed through all of them and found ones that were very soft for me. So I had a little bit of an in. I mean, I kind of grew up in the woods, so I don't know about being an icon. I think I had a little bit of a leg up because
Well,
I
you and I were both scholarship kids. My mom was the nurse for a few
remember her
years.
well.
Yep.
Yeah,
And then eventually I would become the tripmaster at Mowgli, and
that's so cool.
your dad was a legend, along with Mickey Smith and a
Yep.
few others that people remember, Bill Boycourt and
Oh
Jim
gosh,
Boycourt.
yeah,
Yep.
I remember him.
Yep.
And all these
And
names, they kind of everything. My memory's not as sharp as it used to be, so you forgive me if I've forgotten a little bit of the terminology. But I took I went up Cardigan when I first got back here, and we ran into some campers, and they gave me a Mowgli cheer. So it's nice to be well remembered. But I remember your mom because I had ear problems, and I swim, and of course catch cold, and I spent a certain amount of time in the infirmary.
uh-huh.
And I asked about your younger sister. I remember a little blonde girl. And your mom would kind of park me on the couch that was by her desk, and so I could entertain your kid sister.
Uh-huh.
And she probably doesn't remember. She was tiny, but it made me miss my own sister.
I
Probably
bet
the only time I was ever homesick at camp.
she might. I owe her a phone call, so I'm gonna ask her. She lives out in LA now.
Oh yeah, well she would have been tiny, Wayne. She would have,
Yeah.
small enough.
Yeah.
She's fit under my arm. But I read stories to her, and I
Yeah.
was there once or twice, and I can remember upstairs in the infirmary there was a big wooden room where you stayed if you were sick, and I had ear
Oh, right.
infection,
Yep.
and that was the first time I ever heard the Beatles song Yesterday. I still remember hearing it, because your mom put the radio up there for me. Said she's the only first woman I'd ever known. Or that's how I remember it. Maybe she didn't, but when she was I remember we were down on the parade ground there. Somebody fell against one of the rocks and knocked the wind out of it. And I thought he was knocked out. So I ran all the way up to the infirmary. And of course, I got there and I'm going, trying to tell your mom what happened. And she just kind of scolded me for roaring up there and not being, but he was fine when we got back down. But I remember her walking down with her stethoscope, and she was very deliberate, very in control of the situation. She seemed like a formidable woman to us
Oh,
campers.
she was. uh, um, I put I put a little note up on the Mowgli Facebook page that I was going to be, or that I had chatted with you a bit, and I was going to be doing Mowgli Memories podcast with you. And
Mm-hmm.
there were a couple of people who sent me notes, and one of them wanted me to remind you that
Uh-oh.
the original members of the East Hebron Madrigal Society,
Oh gosh.
um, people like I think it might have been Frank Hubbard who sent it to me, who had
Yeah.
been he was a watermaster for
Yeah, I remember him. I remember
years.
yeah, I remember him well. Yeah.
Yeah. And Peter might have even been in your dorm. His brother, younger brother Peter. But anyway,
There was a Peter in my dorm. I thought it was Peter Punderson, but I could be
oh
wrong.
yeah, well that could easily be because
Remember about him? Yeah, he was just a little guy, and I could never beat him at tetherball. Not once. 2 years, I
the,
never
the,
beat him
the
one time.
the Punderson family was famous for their ability in tetherball.
Yeah, and I learned, and the thing is, that's tetherball. Other places is played with something like a soccer ball. It's not the same game at all.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Well,
Yep.
the other times that I tried to play it, and yeah,
Yeah.
crew is not a sport. Of course, it wasn't in Colorado. It's not any water, but you kind of see where the lineage of it came from. But
Well, when the East Hebron Madrigal Society was first formed, and Jim West was telling me this story, um, they they continue to use the Yale songbook as their as the songs
yeah,
that they sing. But
yeah. Men
your
of Harlech, I
grandmother
remember, was Mowgli. What?
your grandmother's favorite song was the song Ora Lee. And uh,
The Oral Lee, that's an old Civil War ballad, I believe.
could be. Yeah, it's very old. Yep. And was either Phil Hart or Jim West. One member of the East Hebron Madrigal Society was always chosen to step forward and in a very serious way say, "This song is dedicated to Irene Gibbs."
You talk about a formidable woman. I'm sure she would have appreciated that. She was a farm woman. All of my family that generation grew up as farmers in that area. When she was 95, she fell on the ice in Plymouth, and she walked to the hospital with a broken ankle. So she was tough, and she had two boys, and I can remember at the farm we would go there when I was a kid, and she had an old cast iron stove that she would cook on. She never used a recipe, or the recipes were all one bowl of salt and one bowl of this and that, but she'd take water and flick it on and the water would dance when the stove was ready. It was my job to go get the wood out of the woodshed.
Huh.
She
Now,
was a great cook.
your dad, that he still has the trail named for him, but he also built a trail right up the side of I think it was Sugarloaf or Bear. I'm not sure which was. It was called the Carter
That could
Gibbs
very well be.
Escalator, and
That I did not know about, Wayne.
huh. Well, it's no longer there because they built all those condominiums by the water there. I
Unfortunately, yeah.
I forget what they're called. It's I
I
think
know what you're talking about.
I'm pretty sure it's on the side of Bear Mountain, but it was uh, the reason they called it the Carter Gibbs Escalator was because he did not build a switchback on the damn thing anyway.
Nope. That's my dad. He always took
it,
the most direct path for
it went
everything.
right up.
Yep, that would have been him. The Carter Gibbs Trail kind of meanders through the woods, and I've ever been on it one time. A lot of friends of mine that I know here knew my parents. They came out every summer to visit me. They would go drive from Ogden, Utah up to Alaska to see my sister, and then they'd drive out here for the rest of the summer to see me. And a lot of friends that I know here got to know him and admired him. And that doesn't surprise me. My dad would not put a switchback in anything. And when he was 88 years old, he might have been a little younger than maybe more like 83. I have a young son named Dylan. He's 17 now, and Dylan was little. I mean, that's where I lived in Bedford. And he's Dylan up on my shoulder. I could keep up with him, and I was in my 50s at that point. But and he would say, he'd go through the woods bouncing my son, and he'd go roop-de-doop for years and years afterwards, when my kids wanted to get up on my shoulder to say, Daddy, roop-de-doop me. And,
That's great. That's great. So,
yeah,
what dorm did you come to first?
I was there 2 years, Wayne. I was there for Panther and Den.
Panther and Den.
And I, basically had a pretty compressed experience of Mowgli, but I don't know, Mowgli. I had been in Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. I got to be a first class scout. I didn't complete it. I got beyond the other levels into that was the next thing I was going to be working on. But we moved from West Virginia to Syracuse, New York, so it didn't translate as an experience for me. So yeah, and I do remember trying to make the most of the experience there. I loved it there, and I always liked the fact that Mowgli was not. They just called it camp for boys, but on the sign, I think it's still there. It's a school of the open, and it always
Yes.
seemed to me
Yep.
more related to programs like Outward Bound than the Boy Scouts.
Right. Right.
And I took my son through Cub Scouts. It's a very different program now, not nearly. I mean, times are different. You can run kids around the back of a truck now for Boy Scouts. The lawsuits would be forever, but it's just different times.
Yeah. Well, those of us who learned how to use an axe from Charlie Walbridge would always say that the scouts were pikers.
That's not well, Charlie. It's interesting. He lived in West Virginia, and
Still
he knew
does.
the river that this called the Cheat River. Is where we lived in West Virginia, and I believe he said he had been on it. I communicated with him for a while
Oh
when I
yeah.
first got back. He tracked me down. It's like you're a member of the pack once. I guess you always are. But he. And we communicated, and he actually wrote up something in one of the howls right after I'd first returned here. But I actually wrote a song about that river. I'm a musician, and it was when I was in Cub Scouts. I was the assistant leader. I was the Boy Scout aide to the woman who ran the Cub Scout troop, and I wasn't on this trip, but one of the boys drowned actually. So it's not a happy song. I mean, but and that was the first time where we met for the church.
Well, it's
And
interesting because, and I imagine that you'll hear from Charlie after he listens to or watches this podcast.
Told me for taking so long.
What's that?
Beg your pardon?
Charlie.
No, I think I cut you off, Wayne. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Charlie has played a very important part in protecting the Cheat River. For years he was part of a group called the Friends of the Cheat. They raised money to work on various put-ins and takeouts, and so he's been very involved with that. And I think it was this past year that he was inducted in the Whitewater Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I remember, and I do try to read the communications from Mowgli. As I said, some of it is I guess almost semi-consciously wanted to leave those memories in that bubble. Things changed so dramatically the year after I graduated, both at camp and the rest of the society. But Charlie was he taught. I already knew how to use an axe, but I learned a lot from Charlie. He doesn't remember this story, but it was an axe yard that was up on the north end of the camp where you would go, and we felled trees. And he told me, he put a stake out, and he told me if I could fell the tree on the stake, then he'd give me the ribbon. And sure, probably 180 degrees the other way. So he doesn't remember that story. And my grandmother liked Charlie very much. He used to go over to the farm. She was very fond of Charlie because he'd write to her and stop by to see her when he was around. He stayed very much in the outdoor life, as you know. But and I liked Charlie. It was, he was kind of always had this kind of outdoorsy ramshackle charm about him at that day. Very soft-spoken, slow-spoken, deliberate. Good guy to teach kids how to use an axe. I remember they had one of the competitions that was basically like the Woodsman's Day or whatever they called it.
Woodsman's Day.
One of one of the competitions was splitting wood, which I knew how to do, and because I split wood for my grandmother, and it was whoever could split the smallest piece, and the very last piece was the size of a matchstick, and I managed to split that piece of wood in half. So it was, it was just, again, good fortune. Couldn't do it now. Probably couldn't even see it at this point.
So your den year was 1960.
I was there 65 and 66 because by
Okay.
67 I graduated. Well, I was 67. I was through den at 66. And I say one of the great, I guess you'd say, honors that I felt at camp. I mentioned this on the phone. The counselors, they would get somebody that out of den that they thought had been a good leader, I guess they say, or that somebody that they liked, and I was picked. And of course, they picked up your bed and they carried you down to the waterfront, trying to be all. Of course, I knew immediately, and I pretended to be asleep. Then they threw you in the lake. that was their honor. That meant a lot to me. I mean, because I was a team captain of the Charlatanic Shoshones, and I thought you were on my team, but you might not have been. You were enough younger than me. You might not have been. But I do remember you from camp.
It was always fun coming up with the names, for the teams, because they usually had two parts to them. One was, they would say, okay, one's an Indian tribe and another is a color,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And
yep.
Charlotte, I was, I'll say this: we all knew what the word meant. So, but that was interesting. You asked me about Jim West. He, I didn't take his dance class. I did not, but I do remember. Correct me if I'm wrong. He gave a demonstration of it that I can remember him doing.
Oh yeah.
And it was, he was in full dress, full regalia, and the connection. I knew it. I knew he was Northern Cheyenne, was or is, and my daughter's name is Cheyenne. That's what I named my daughter. I played my first musical job in the West in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So it was, I don't know. Yeah. And I became quite a amateur student of the Plains Indians religions and so on and so forth. I'd love to have you say hi to him for me. But
I definitely will. He'll be very excited to hear about that.
Well, I'd be excited. Yeah, excited as well. I mean, and he, I told you this on the phone, the story of the curtains that hung in the assembly hall there. His father, Wapanaya, painted those. And my dad had a couple of stories about it, but I remember the most. There were 5 panels, and the large one in the middle that actually covered the stage was Mowgli at the council where Bagheera and Baloo got up to speak for him, and he's playing with some stones. And before Wapanaya finished the painting, Mowgli was shooting dice. He was throwing dice instead of the stones. So, those paintings are still extant. I mean, I ended up with 2 of them at the house in Utah, and there was one where Mowgli was walking with Bagheera and Kaa. And then there's another one where he's it's actually Raksha is in the cave where Shere Khan's trying to get after Mowgli, and she's defending him. So,
Wow.
Yeah.
So
I'm not sure that one was actually a panel. I think there may have actually been only 3 panels. Now that I think of it.
Yeah, there were 3 panels, but he did paint a lot of. I don't know that he painted a lot, but he painted a number of smaller ones over the years. It almost looks like that painting on the wall might be one of his.
No, actually, that's my son's he's a Japanophile. That's
okay.
It's a Japanese rendering. But art. My sister is an artist. She was an art teacher in Alaska, and there was a painting that I'm speculating. I think may have been gifted to him by Wapanaya to my grandmother that was at the farm of a Cheyenne chief in full regalia. And I don't know where that is, but it was a beautiful, they were actually reference works for the curtains and so on and so forth. Right? Wonderfully done.
Yeah. So So what was the most memorable trip that you took while you were?
Oh, well, I was thinking that's funny you asked that question, Wayne. I was thinking that same thing. The Washington squads. I went on the Gopher squad and then the Washington squad. Those are very, very memorable. And that was, as you said, kind of one of the highlights of the year. And I was more on the hiking, camping end of things. I mean, I had raced. Did swim racing when I was there, and when I was younger, I was a swim racer in high school. And the Washington squad, something about that mountain, and it kind of it goes along with the idea of the school. It's a serious mountain. I've been reading lately about things about people that have died on Mount Washington. There's a very famous book called Not Without Peril, very well written about. And it was a serious mountain. When we went up I remember going up the Ammonoosuc, you took off from where the cog was, and it was a point of honor that you never went up the cog. If you're going up Washington, you walked. And finally, the last summer, I took my son and a good friend of his camping up on the Kankomagas, and I wanted to walk up, but he had a friend with him that was, he's a big guy. He's overweight, and it would have been difficult. So we took the cog, and my son is a big fan of trains. So it was all right. I didn't get struck by lightning. My dad didn't roll anything down from heaven on me, but or from wherever. And we enjoyed the ride up. And the next day, I had a heart attack, which almost exactly a year ago. It was a year ago Monday. So and I'm recovering. Yeah, I'm fine. Tough to kill, but it's it was just interesting. And I had intended to climb Washington this year. Challenge. Not really quite fit, and I'm pretty sure my son is not. He's a video gamer, so. But next year, we're going to go up Cardigan here in a couple of weeks. But
Well,
I took him up there.
it's probably very fortunate that you didn't climb Cardigan that day that you took the cog, given that you had a heart attack the next day.
Yeah, well, we were going to go up Washington. That's what I wanted to do.
Yeah, that's what I meant, Washington.
Yeah, and Cardigan was like kind of, we went. I don't know if we went up it in camp or not, but I climbed it several times, and I took my son up there when he was younger. And it's a very rewarding view. For if you go up the Canaan side, it's not really and that was where we ran into the campers the one summer. And it's also, there's a trail there. They dedicated the hut there to Mickey Smith, who I thought was my dad's friend, partner in crime, but it was actually, he was Mickey Smith Jr., Clyde Smith Jr. And the hut was Charlie actually corrected me on this. And he I didn't know that, but there's trails up there that they would have been familiar with. And when I was in photography school, Smith younger became very well regarded wildlife photographer. He did books on Alaska, which was kind of dovetailed with the fact that my sister lived there, so she knew who he was too. But it's interesting how things kind of, I don't know, knit together for me.
So after you were at Mowgli, tell us about your life. What did you do?
Well, I went to the University of Colorado. I mean, it had playing guitar had always been a passion of mine. I actually, when we went up on the Washington squad up, they had one of the hut boys had a guitar there, and at that point I hadn't been playing but a few years, and I couldn't play without a pick, so they had a nail file. And I used that for a guitar pick, and I broke one of the strings on the guitar, and he used a nail file, So part of the thing I wanted to do either this last trip or next time around is go up Washington and bring back a nail file, a little frame, Back then, I don't know if this is still the case, but the hut boys used to run back and forth between the huts. They all kept cats, and they'd steal each other's cats. And I heard a book about it recently that said that. It was like a propeller of some kind, they would do that too. I mean, and that's not to be trifled with, running around the guitar. But it was kind of a sport younger. But my dad used to tell about one of the hut boys. His name was Dorcas Brown, and they used to pack everything up from base camp. And he had a load of blankets and other things. And for a joke, they put parts of the cast iron stove in it, and he hoisted it on his back and walked up the hill with it. He was a legend among the Hut boys. And one of the guys I remember, his name was Linus, one of the Hut boys. We kept running into him everywhere, and he was, disheveled in a camperly sort of way, but he was obviously a dedicated outdoorsman. But and when I went to high school in Vermont, and went to the University of Colorado. And of course, the year that I went, I graduated from high school in 1968, which was a year of great upheavals. I mean, there could not have been any more greater distance between Mowgli in 1966 and Colorado in 68. It's a different culture, partly, but my dad and mom kind of insisted, and I wanted to go to young. And they said, "Well, try it." And they said, ever willing to take a risk? And he said, "Sure." And I ended up living there off and on for about 5 years. The outdoors there, it was a big part of my life there. Did a lot of hiking, a lot of camping, canoeing, all that kind of stuff. And I was in and out of school. 68 was the year that Martin Luther King was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. They had student riots in Chicago. So there was a lot of upheaval. I mean, I didn't finish college. I was in and out. And I never looked at playing music as a career, although I will say, like a lot of kids of my generation, I saw the Beatles come on TV February 9th, 1964, and I saw the young girls screaming. I said, "That's my job." And it took me a while to get around to, and God gives us different gifts, not always in line with the ones you think you're going to get. And I guess I did become spiritual, and then religious. I consider myself Christian, but Boulder's a little bit like the Nepal of or Kathmandu. Colorado's the Nepal of America for me. It's and there's Buddhism, the Plains Indian religion I looked into quite a bit. And again, from my perspective, as someone who's not Native American, but there were a lot of famous books about it. But Colorado was, a lot of what I learned at Mowgli. There again, it was a through line from Mowgli through camping in Colorado. I mean, it always amazed me how many people can't make a campfire. It's simple. I don't think my dad showed me, and I know I didn't get it in Scouts, but you got tinder kindling in the wood. Somebody always skips one of those steps, so their fires don't work. But and those kind of things are kind of embedded. When we were younger, we always camped when we went out. We had this old green Army surplus tent that weighed about 80 pounds. That thing weighed a ton. This is before nylon tents, and my dad would have to get in it and put up this tree that held it up. And it was because it was surplus. You'd come out all covered with this green stuff. But we had the best time in those tents because they were involved with us. My dad would, give me an axe or a knife and go out, and he trusted me not to hurt myself. Maybe not always wisely, but he sort of learned a lot from him. But after Colorado, I did play quite a bit there. And I kind of to a point in Colorado where I had a ski accident. I was nearly killed. I tend to collide with things, but I was actually and I fell down as we skied into the side of my head. So I had a concussion. There's something called the Glasgow Trauma Score, which is 15 points. I was at 3. Anything less than that's coma and death. But I came out of the coma, or at least most of the way out of it. Some people might argue that I didn't, but and the first thing I did, of course, is get on my motorcycle and. But I was taking a drug called Dilantin, which made me very, it was an anti-seizure drug. I had such a strong fight or flee reaction. I got helicoptered off the hill, but I don't remember any of it. That was the best part of it. But when I went through that, I decided that it was time to leave the West, and because I was, still kind of searching, I guess you'd say at that point. I went up a trip up to Alaska to see my sister Gail, who lived in Wasilla. And you stay on the deck of the ferry, the Alaska State Ferry. And I actually had a lawn chair. There was a lawn chair. You throw your sleeping bag in a lawn chair. And it was one of the best outdoor trips I ever took. We saw killer whales. I counted 42 eagles. I thought I'd see big mountains in Colorado, but there was just range after range, very, very wild there. And this was quite a while ago. And I decided my grandparents still had a farm. My mother's parents had a farm in Bedford, and they had passed away. And so I came out that summer to help, clear it out and look after it. And so my parents, till they decided what they wanted to do with it. And that was 30 years ago. So I decided, well, the way I kind of put it to myself, my father had been a photographer in the Air Force, or was one of his jobs, and he kind of picked it up as a hobby. He was always taking pictures when we were kids. So I kind of, my father never understood about wanting to play music. For him, it was like telling him I wanted to be a criminal. But when I got older, I finally did, these names might not mean anything to you if you don't follow but there was the artist, he was a country artist, Charlie Daniels. He did Devil Went Down to Georgia.
Devil Went Down to Georgia.
Yeah, Devil Went Down to Georgia. And we opened on a bill with him several times, and there was others, Marshall Tucker.
Oh, sure.
And we played all the big venues in New Hampshire. We played at the racetrack at Loudon Racetrack, and the structure engine.
So your band opened for Marshall Tucker and Charlie Daniels, huh?
Yeah, different type of artists, and that band stayed together for 25 years. They were all part of a church group, the St. Marie's Church Group in Manchester, a Catholic church group, and great guys. I mean, we were more like brothers. But again, some of that part of the experience in Mowglis that appealed to me is you really learned what it meant to be part of a team or part of a crew. And that was what made the crew race the perfect sport for there. But, I mean, I remember as a team leader, you had people, I mean, and they were like mostly, the scavenger hunt where, if you've ever been in one scavenger hunt, the stuff is at the place where it started. There's a tree where you start, you go all around the camp, and there it is. So I tried not to spoil it for everybody, but that's where it was. I forget where we were looking for, but you had to get camp up. Gene Shepard, the comedian, actually did a whole article about that. But the camp wasn't frivolous. It was really, I don't know, but it was a lot of good memories. And that's, from there, I, decided that I hadn't done anything dangerous and stupid for a while. So when I was 52, I got married. That was the first time, a woman who was singing in a band that I was asked to join. We got married when I was 52, and then when I was 55, I had my son Dylan, and 57 had my daughter Cheyenne. So they're still teenagers. So what was I thinking? But that's a variety of different things I've done. So I actually did go to Hallmark Institute of Photography in Massachusetts. I ran a photography business for a while, and but the music was always the passion. And it's I will say that the way I was brought up, we traveled all the time. My dad, I think, was a frustrated truck driver. We took long car trips. One Christmas, we drove from Nacogdoches, Texas, to Hebron and Bedford, where my other grandparents lived, and we were only there and here for one day. And we stopped and saw both grandparents and drove back. But they were great adventures. My dad really, he was fearless. I mean, and his life, if you look at it, was a great adventure. He started out as a farm boy in Hebron, New Hampshire, and he actually ended up speaking before Congress. He wrote some of the classic texts about using tubing to collect maples for Congress. And when he retired, one of the women that worked for him was part Indian and gave him an eagle feather because he had a tendency to tilt against authority if he thought things were unjust, and he had stood up for her and some of the women employees that he had. And he actually in the 60s he drove down to, I think it was Alabama, to get a young black scientist that worked for him, and he drove her back up here. And the society was different then, and he made sure she had a place to live. And he said in Vermont, they don't care what color you are, any color they care about's green. And he was right. He found her a place to live, and she went into a very successful career. But he was my hero, still is. he was, he was a good role model. And I think a lot of what he learned and knew, he admired Colonel Elwell very, very much. I met Colonel Elwell as a boy. And I swear to God, I remember that he had a monocle. I don't know that he actually did, but he looked the very picture of the British, uh, like the British colonel. Everybody called him the colonel.
Right.
And he had a Mowgli uniform on, and he spoke around the place, which is the name of his home. It's up on where you turn off from the highway there above the East Shore Road.
Now
But
there were
so that kind of
was
brings
was Doug George in your dorm?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
I remember. Yeah, and it's funny. I was trying to think. There was Worthy Johnson,
Worthy
Chris
Johnson.
Howard.
Sure. Yeah. He's still
Chris
around.
Howard and I were pretty close, and he and I were very different. He was very, I don't know how to put it. He made me laugh. He just was really funny, and he very, very quiet. But he'd always have some pithy remark that would just put me in stitches. And you've noticed I never stopped talking. So it was good for him because he didn't have to talk except to say the pithy things. But and Peter Punderson, like I said, I've never forgiven for trouncing me royally at tetherball every time. I remember the Damasi brothers. I don't think they were in my dorm. I think they were younger. Then there was.
Well, there was Lenny who was older.
I tried on.
And there was Lenny who was older, and then Teddy and Tommy who were probably a year younger than you.
Right. Young. Yep. And I don't know. I can't remember exactly who else was in Den. There was someone named Jeff, but I don't remember his last name. And Robert O'Connor, of course. I was close with Robert O'Connor too, or talked with him a lot. He was very kind of quiet. I mentioned the story. They had the fancy dress ball, and I couldn't figure out where to.
Jeff Guilfoy, because he mentioned you to me in a note.
Yeah. Well, that's fabulous. I'll have to contact some of these folks because I haven't literally communicated with anybody but you and Charlie since I left camp.
Well, if I can have your permission, I'll put your email in the show notes so that people can get in touch with you.
Love to. I mean, it comes back in these kind of little explosions. I mean, as you were saying, just because I moved so much, it was always kind of a matter of don't look back. I actually played at my 50th high school reunion in South Burlington, Vermont, with the drummer that I was in high school. So I mean, it's kind of coming back here was a matter of rediscovering roots. And Mowgli is kind of it was what mountain men call shining times. It was like, it was just something magical about the whole thing. I can still remember sitting, when they would give the talk at the end of the day. Bill Hart would sit up on the rock, and usually some kind of, I don't know, very simple but very heartfelt and very direct and pointed observations about life. I don't remember, I wouldn't call them sermons, but they were like that. And I couldn't remember the song you would sing at the end of the day. And now day is done. That's all I remember of it. But it was, and the sun would be going down over the lake.
Evening sunset paints the sky.
That's it.
Yep.
That's it. Right? And you had asked about special moments from Camp One. I remember, and I'm pretty sure it was on Jefferson. We went up Jefferson. It must have been as part of one of the Washington trips that I took. There's on and that's exactly what happened. We were laying down, the wind was high enough, and looking down, and I remember seeing the valley down there and thought, well, I'm with a bunch of people that are very different. My experience is different than people who haven't done this. That's probably the only way I could say that without sounding elitist, but it made me feel, that it was something special about the White Mountains. I'm going to get my son up there, but still got the ability next year, Washington. That's
well, my the last time that I hiked Washington was with my son, and we went up the Ridge of the Caps Trail up the side of Jefferson, and then over to Washington, and it was it was terrific. It was really
Yeah.
wonderful. We took one of his friends, and we had it was a very windy day, and my
Yeah.
kid was
I think it's pretty much always that way. But yeah,
yeah
it's that's fabulous, Wayne. Yeah, it's interesting how strands run through people's lives. Like in your case, I did not know that you're a Native American, and you're kind of like Native Americans. Obviously, correct me if I'm wrong. The oral tradition is very important. You're kind of the story keeper of Mowgli.
yeah.
Like
I guess you could say I am. So yeah,
right.
yeah.
And you
The
said you
oral
were part of the legislature. I mean, again, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm one of those guys that thinks they know everything, but I believe that the Iroquois were one of the first tribes that came up with a form of legislative government. They had council meetings. They were probably the first ones on the North American continent to do that.
yeah
I always, New Hampshire has always had a great respect for the outdoors and for democracy. I mean, and there's a reason they have the first country here. So
yeah
it's been interesting to hear and interesting to be back.
yeah. Well, that's it's true. The Iroquois Confederacy, in a lot of
Yeah,
ways, was important to the founding of our own Constitution. Yeah.
yeah. My dad was a huge history buff. And when we were younger, I'd say we did car trips. I mean, you take and we went to all the national parks because he worked for the Forest Service, and anything, he took us to Gettysburg, and it was always a great time, no matter and there was always, anyway, he just had a respect for that kind of thing that I
Yeah.
think uh, passed down to me and my sister.
Right. And when did you move back from the West?
Uh, I moved back in 19. I said I'd had the ski accident, and after the trip up to Alaska, I wanted to do something different than I had been doing. Things were just so chaotic and culturally and politically, and that I lost. I was coming back here to kind of find my feelings again. So I lived at the farm, and I went to photography school here. And that would have been in '87. And I after that ran a business of probably 4 or 5 years. Uh, After I got out of photography school, then I worked at the Institute of Art in Manchester,
Oh yeah.
uh, and I continued in photography. I found out as a photographer, there's two parts of it. There's the aesthetic and the technical, and I found out I was better at the technical part of it than the aesthetic, which was a surprise. I just didn't have the eye that a lot of other photographers did. But even after I closed the studio, there was a studio in Manchester run by a friend of mine that I assisted at. And I played music. Some of it was, uh, music it's always a huge gamble. The percentage of people that make it to the national touring level very early days. And quite frankly, some of those I probably was not as talented, but some of you have to be driven and you have to be willing to give up a lot of things. And the people I played with, it was called the Jimmy LaHoo Band, and they were he was a French Canadian from here, from the West Side there in Manchester. He, and he later became an alderman. I got to say this: he's the only other musician I ever played with who became an alderman. But
Wow.
he reached a point, and he was always very grounded. And there comes a point where you have to sacrifice a lot of things to do it. And he very wisely chose in favor of his family, and he runs a construction business now. We still get together, but we played. We played at the track, the racetrack. We played at Gillette Stadium on the Kenny Chesney tour. But we were always local heroes, or loco heroes, I guess you could say.
Playing side by each.
Yeah, exactly. We got the stairs in my shoes. No offense to our Canadian friends, but and it's funny because Manchester, I kind of, as being interested, my grandfather worked here as the dye master for my maternal grandfather worked for Pandora Sweaters, which was
Wow.
these beautiful wool sweaters and
Yeah.
very well regarded in the 50s. And of course, I didn't like wool because it was scratchy. Basically, looking back, he would buy me these gorgeous sweaters, and I said, "No, I want the other one, the polyester one." So he would, but he could take a piece of fabric in his hands and tell what the quality of the threads were. And he was, I think, where some of the musical lineage came from. My father, and this is unbeknownst to pretty much everybody, he loved poetry. And he said, it was hard to be a country boy in the backwoods in New Hampshire and love poetry, but he did, and he could recite poems that he memorized. Boy, there was a one-room schoolhouse head of, I think it's called the North Shore Road. But as you come over from Plymouth, that road, it's like an insurance agency or something now, but it was a one-room schoolhouse. And his favorite one was Invictus, which was black as the night that covers me pole to pole. I think whatever unconquerable gods there may be or whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. That was my dad. That was him in a nutshell.
Wow. Isn't that interesting? And
You would have liked him. Everybody does. I mean, my adult friends, Jimmy LaHoo, that whole crew, we've been for years. I've told him I'm going to walk over the Cardigan Gibbs trail. After I had the heart attack, I went up there, because somebody found it for me. My photographer friend, actually, that I worked for did. And I've been on the very first little bit of it on the sculptured rocks side. As I remember, it's not really a very exciting trail. I think the only time I was on it was in trail clearing at the end of one of my years at Mowglis. But we were all going to go over to honor my dad. They felt the same about him as I did. I mean, he just had that effect on people. He was not a tall man. He was only 5'6", but I always said he was the real man they patterned the movie character of John Wayne after. He had the same haircut they gave him. They gave him in the Air Force, and never got a different one. And I asked him once, "What kind of music do you like, Dad?" He said, "Well, I like that song, 'Take This Job and Shove It' by Johnny Paycheck." "Dad, that's a song. That's not a type of music." He said, "Yeah, I like that song by Johnny Paycheck." He was no nonsense kind of guy. But he finally figured, well, maybe this music thing's okay. He came to see us play with Charlie Daniels, who he'd heard of. And, I wouldn't say that we were friends, but we appeared with him several times. And as more modern artists like Phil Vassar used to come to town. We played in Plymouth. There's a place called the Flying Monkey.
Yep.
At theater, and we played there many times on different bills. And actually, we headlined there once or twice. I mean, he was national, he got signed, and he had a record that he put out. But it was a risk rewards kind of a decision for him and for all of us. I mean, of course, me being me, I was ready to go. Sure, why not? But it was, he chose in favor of a more responsible adult life. That's one of the jokes about being a guitar player. The kid says to his mom, "Mom, I want to be a guitar player when I grow up." And mom says, "Well, you have to choose, son. You can't do both." I think that
perfect. That's a perfect place for us to end, Scot Gibbs. Well, this has been so much fun, and
me too, Wayne. And thank you again for your persistence in getting me to do this. I've looked forward to it, and it's been even better than I expected. You're a wonderful raconteur yourself,
and I'm sure you're going to hear from a lot of your old friends.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. That'll be interesting. Like I said, hopefully well remembered. I mean, this is just another chapter at this point. Who knows? Helen Keller had a saying, one of my favorite ones. He said, "Life's a daring adventure, or it's nothing." And I think the Mowgli, that was what I took away from it. The main thing was a sense of adventure.
Yeah, life is a daring adventure or nothing. Yep,
Yep.
That's one of my favorite quotes by her as well. All right, well, you take care, my friend. Good hunting, my brother.
Thank you again, Wayne. Yeah, you as well.